the last 3 episodes, we've explored the incredible feats of innovation and perseverance, and unfortunately, death, that it took to build the Gunnison Tunnel, a part of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation's Uncompahgre project that flows water from the Gunnison River at the bottom of the Black Canyon to the upper south end of the Uncompahgre Valley, where the water is used to transform one of our country's most arid landscapes into a verdant agricultural oasis where every one of the valley's 50,000 citizens benefits from the project. Indeed, every drop of municipal potable water throughout the winter months is provided by this tunnel. If you haven't listened to those previous 3 episodes, I encourage you to do so. But that said, this episode on how the water is distributed to the Uncompahgre Valley and how the project is operated today should stand on its own. As usual, references and backup materials can be found in the show notes. Hi, my name is Brody Wilson, and I live in the Uncompahgre Valley. I'm a mechanical engineer here in Colorado and work in corporate sustainability, but have grown up right next to the primary canal that carries Gunnison Tunnel water. My life was shaped and infused by the water that flows through this tunnel. This is the 4th of 4 episodes in which I'm telling you the story of the Gunnison Tunnel and associated canals, collectively known as the Uncompahgre Project. In the last episode, we covered the tunnel's actual construction and the engineering that went into that. In this final episode, we cover the distribution system and the system's operation today. I'm telling this story because most of us take our water for granted. And for those of us that live in the arid western U.S., there's a story like this one behind every city, town, and agricultural valley in the West. And while water is sure to remain a crucial issue for decades to come in the Colorado River Basin, I think we'll all just make better decisions if we understand just how much has gone into enabling our water use today. Our way of life, really. Let's continue our story. We left off with the tunnel's completion at the end of 1909, but that was actually far from the end of the project's construction. The Bureau of Rec had spent $2.9 million on the tunnel and diversion dam at the East Portal. One interesting tidbit, the tunnel was done before the diversion dam, and once the tunnel construction was complete, it enabled the team to move materials for the East Portal diversion dam through the tunnel, rather than the much longer and arduous journey over Vernal Mesa and down the perilous East Portal Road. Let me spend a moment describing the East Portal diversion dam. This is not a tall concrete arch dam like you might be picturing when I say dam. Rather, a humble structure that simply raises the level of the river a bit so that it can be diverted into the mouth of the tunnel. McConnell and team constructed a huge, basically flat foundation of large timbers across the riverbed, then arranged a series of supports, picture like A-frame joists, to hold up flat boards like plywood. No kidding, they still use plywood covered in tarpaulin today. Those are supported by a basic metal frame from the downstream side. The dam only raises the level of the river about 6 to 10 feet, but enough to fill the headgates for the tunnel. While the water from the tunnel was put to immediate use, the construction of the distribution system continued for another 16 years. The west portal of the tunnel is just south of the turnoff that you take off of Highway 50 to go up to the south rim of the Black Canyon National Park. Most people have no idea it is there. In fact, if you continue east on Highway 50, you drive right over the tunnel. From the west portal, the project's second biggest piece of infrastructure begins. The South Canal is approximately 30 feet wide and 12 feet deep and runs 11 miles south and falls about 300 feet over those 11 miles to a point where it dumps into the Uncompahgre River. From there, a portion of the tunnel water does a U-turn and heads north downstream in the Uncompahgre River, and another, smaller portion flows over the Uncompahgre in an aqueduct that kind of looks like a railroad trestle and begins the West Canal. This canal runs some 22 miles along the western edge of the valley. Now, these canals are far from simple structures. The terrain they pass through is hilly, rolling, soft adobe soil, and the canals often pass through the hills in tunnels and across small valleys in aqueducts, like a bridge for water, and via siphons. Now, you can probably picture an aqueduct and a tunnel, but a siphon is an entirely different animal. Picture a tube of water bent into a U shape. Now, lower one end of the tube. That's the outlet side. Pour water in the higher side, and an equal amount of water flows out of the outlet side. Well, that's how these siphons work. But on the South Canal, they're huge, like big enough to drive a small car through, or certainly a four-wheeler. When you stand next to the inlet side of these things, it's a little spooky. It kind of throws your eyes for a loop. We're just not used to seeing such huge volumes of water just kind of disappear into thin air and then reemerge on the other side of the arroyo only slightly lower. It's wild. While there's much less written about the construction of these tunnels, aqueducts, and siphons, most of them were constructed at the same time that the tunnel was, and certainly had some similar challenge and required similar perseverance. But it's not just canals, laterals, and ditches. The system has some 7 diversion dams, depending on how you count, on the Uncompahgre River, where that tunnel water that was dumped in at the top of the system gets pulled out or diverted into a new canal. Again, this is really best appreciated by looking at a map. Check out the show notes. When the federal government took charge of the Uncompahgre project, they required the local citizens to form an organization to coordinate matters for the future water users of the system. Accordingly, those that had been pushing for a tunnel got together and formed a representative organization. They had their first meeting in Olathe in 1902. They called the organization the Uncompahgre Valley Water Users Association, and the organization still exists today. We locals just call it the Water Users. And I wanted to learn as much as I could about the operation of the current system, and so I asked for some time with the general manager, and he was gracious enough to spend some time with me.
My name is Steve Pope, and I am the general manager of the Uncompahgre Valley Water Users. Well, I've been with Water Users 2 years. I started in December of 2021. Prior to that, I worked for the state engineer, the state of Colorado, administering water rights and augmentation plans in the Colorado River Basin.
Steve is the guy at the Water Users and is responsible for the overall operation, planning, and financial management of the system that delivers a critical resource to thousands of farms in the valley and to the water treatment plant that provides drinking water to all 50,000 plus people in the valley. The water he administers is the lifeblood of this community. Without it, these towns would not be here. His pedigree with the Colorado State Water Engineer's Office is prestigious. The Colorado State Water Engineer is a critical office not just for Colorado, but for all of the states to which water that flows out of Colorado is connected. I asked him how he found his way to this job.
Well, it was a great opportunity. I was nearing the end of my career with the State Engineer's Office. My family was leaving, and this position came up, and
Nice.
It's something that I've always been very excited about. I guess one of the things, as I worked for the state, I was really focused on very complex engineering, which was involving small amounts of water. So we would sit here and we would sit at these tables and argue over a quarter of an acre foot during the shoulder seasons, and the opportunity to physically move large volumes of water around and put it on fields was very appealing to me. So
Yeah, cool.
actually dealing with what we call wet water. A lot of times we look at water and it's on paper.
Just listen to Steve describe the organization.
So we operate, back up, our system is the Uncompahgre Valley, which extends from just south of Montrose near that vernal, a little bit north of Kelowna, down to Delta. We service about 84,000 acres of farm ground. We have a staff of 40 to 45 employees, predominantly a group of ditch riders that go out daily to administer the head gates within the system, maintenance crews and equipment operators, a small office staff of 4 that handle all the billing and accounting that goes along with operating this system, specifically, the RRA forms. So because we are a federal facility, or we are operating a federal facility under contract, we have to follow under the Reclamation Reform Act of 1989. And there's stipulations on how much land any one individual in the project can hold. And so we track every real estate transaction and track the water, because the water is tied to the land. So if a property divides and splits, well, we make sure that 10 shares go to the 10 acres of irrigated ground, and the remainder would stay with the other parcel.
Okay, for the layperson, there was a lot of information in what Steve just said, but first, I want to focus on this part.
Because the water is tied to the land.
I went to the National Archives in Broomfield and saw the original contract between the Uncompahgre Valley water users and the federal government from 1903, and that original contract makes this point absolutely clear. For every acre, there is a share. There are mechanisms that allow for areas that will never be irrigated to give back their share to the company, but those are rare. And that means that when a 40-acre field gets carved up into 10 4-acre parcels in a subdivision, well, Steve and his staff have to account for that in their records and bring all those new landowners into the company and give them their shares, inform them of their rights and responsibilities, and make sure they pay their fair share to the company. Steve showed me the original 120-year-old maps of the valley that they still use for this, on which the ownership records are still stored. It was pretty cool. But this whole water is tied to the land thing brings up a whole nother question. Whose water is it really? I asked Steve.
We do not own our water rights. The federal government owns our water right. Technically, none of the water users within our system that own shares own a water right. You own shares in a company. The company manages a system that's owned by the federal government. So all of our facilities and all of the water rights are still maintained in the name of the federal government. So they can't be bought and sold.
Interesting, eh? In other areas, if you have a water right that maybe you're not using or not using all of, you can sell that water right to someone else. In fact, this is happening all along the Front Range of Colorado as municipalities scramble to secure water rights to ensure their booming cities have enough water to support the anticipated growth. In the Uncompahgre Valley, not so. Every acre gets a share, whether you like it or not. But does that mean that everyone in the valley puts the same amount of water on their land, uses the same amount of water per acre? No. You heard Steve mention the ditch riders that administer the head gates in the system. Well, every landowner contacts their ditch rider and orders their water. And it's that ditch rider's responsibility to adjust the head gates to give the landowner the appropriate flow rate of water depending on their type of soil. Wait, type of soil? Yeah, get this.
Each of our shares, they're assigned to a volume of water. So we have two different classes of shares. We have what are called mesa shares, mesa soils, and then adobe soils. Mm-hmm. And as an example, a mesa soil would get 0.02 cubic feet per second per share, which equates to about 11 gallons a minute.
Okay.
Adobe soil gets 0.0167, slightly less. So if you had 10 shares of mesa soil, you would get 20 hundredths of a cubic foot per second, or roughly 90 gallons a minute.
I checked Steve's math on this, and he was, from the seat of his pants there, spot on. Steve talked a bit more about the size and complexity of the distribution system, a system that irrigates 84,000 acres.
We're responsible for maintaining the delivery system and drains for that. So we have roughly 720 miles of canals, laterals, and drains. Our longest canal would be the M&D Canal, which is probably one of the more famous older ones, the Montrose and Delta. And I believe it's just shy of 34 miles long. It starts out there on Trout Road. That's the head gate, Trout Road on the Uncompahgre, and and the tail end, it is out off of Carnation and the very far northwestern portion of the valley.
And it's got siphons and aqueducts.
Numerous siphons, flumes. There are no pumps. That's the one interesting thing about this system. If you look at the geography, when you get out onto California Mesa, Ash Mesa, and all of these different land features, we don't pump one drop of water. Everything is gravity fed.
720 miles? Holy smokes. And no pumps? It is a real feat of surveying and engineering this system. And just in case the sheer size wasn't enough to grapple with, listen to this.
But the one thing about it is this valley is still really heavily comprised of small family operations. It's not like we have big corporate farms out there. Mm-hmm. These are multi-generational and small farmers, truck farms. And so
Yeah.
that's where we kind of maintain that local community
Cool.
of farmers, which is very unique to an operation of, this size. You go to Southern California and look at those properties in the Imperial Valley. I was down on a tour of the lower basin, touring the Palo Verde irrigation district. They irrigate about 100,000 acres, so they're bigger than us by a little bit.
Yeah.
And I asked how many water users they had, and they said 30. We have 3,500. So it kind of gives you a little proportional scale. I mean, and they were all corporate farms.
That's kind of crazy.
These guys are irrigating 10 to 12,000 acres of ground.
That fact kind of astounded me. Just doing the math here real quick. The Palo Verde system averages about 3,300 acres per user. The Uncompahgre, 24. This system has way more users, and our farms are, on average, much smaller. I'm sure that cuts both ways, right? In Palo Verde, you can put all the users in a room and hear from each one of them. In the Uncompahgre Valley, there is a lot more user administration. So next, I got kind of curious about this. What happens when there's not enough water? Who gets their headgate shut off first? Well, it turns out that every shareholder has an equal priority, and if there's not enough water in a given year, everyone's volume is reduced proportionally. I discussed this with Steve.
One of the interesting things is, when we start our irrigation season, we look at snowpack. We meet with the Bureau. They run models on projected runoff flows, and we look at we get with our board and we talk about all kinds of things. And we said, well, this year we're not going to have enough water to give everybody their 100% of their allocation. So we have to, we make the decision of we're going to go to a 70%, or 80%, or some proportion.
You make that decision at the beginning of the season to go on
We
percentage?
start it, we say yes, well, there's two parts. We say yes, we're probably going to go on percentage this year based on snowpack. So everybody knows that they can plan, they can buy crop insurance, they can make all of these financial decisions regarding their ag business.
Yeah.
And then and then some years, we've had, a couple of years where we looked like we were doing great, and then the bottom fell out. There was no monsoons.
Right.
It got hot. So then we might start out with 100% allocation, but then have to go to percentages later in the year.
Imagine you're a farmer with a lot of land, and you're deciding how much and what types of seed to put in the ground. Say the snowpack looked good, and you decided to plant a lot of onions and field corn. That's corn for animal feed that uses a lot of late-season water. Then, right about the time you need the water to finish off your onions and corn, the water user says, sorry guys, predictions were off. We're going to reduce your water down to 70%. These decisions, these operations have real implications for people whose lives and livelihoods depend on this water.
And it's funny because you can never outguess Mother Nature.
Right.
One year, I believe, we purchased some water out of Bridgeway, additional water, and as soon as we purchased it, started raining. It didn't stop.
You can go both ways.
It goes both ways. Yeah. So, it's a challenge. You really have to look at a lot of different factors. And you're looking at the weather projections. You're looking at the runoff. The big issue with this drought or drier climate that we've been in is the soil moisture is not there. So as an example, I believe it was 2019 or 2020, 2019, we had a decent snowpack, but we didn't have any runoff because the previous years have been so dry that
just sucked it up.
It just never made it to the rivers.
So Steve has to have a really good forecast of the volume of water the system will have for the season. That's a whole field of science in and of itself. But even when there's enough water, just getting it to each user proportionally is also a bit of an art. Check it out.
And another interesting thing, this is the most complicated part of our system, is we are so heavily reliant on return flows. So We use water.
Say for real quickly what a return flow is.
So the return flows are, the water that runs off of a field. A lot of places in the lower basin states, even in the Grand Valley, they divert water out of the Colorado River. They put it on a field. It runs back into a drain and it runs right back into the river. And then they don't use it again. We use water 7 times, roughly.
7 times?
Before it leaves our control. So we'll divert water out of the tunnel and we'll put it in one of the canals. Somebody will put it on a field. It'll get into a drain back into the river. We'll divert it out of the next canal all the way through the system. And as we get down the further northwest corner of our project, outside the west of Olathe and north of Olathe, they're heavily, heavily reliant on these return flows. And, everybody talks about, well, we should be very efficient in our system and put in sprinklers and drip. Well, we need them to be inefficient to make the water up for their neighbor. That's part of the system there. So it's a very complicated when we get to when it comes to water management, much more so than a lot of other projects in our state.
I don't think that anyone would argue that efficiency is bad, but this isn't like energy efficiency where what you save is saved. And certainly when the Uncompahgre Valley as a whole uses less water, there's more available downstream. But the nature of the Uncompahgre Valley water users system is there are areas where if one user gets super efficient or decides to fallow their field for a year, the downstream neighbor might not get the water they're entitled to. When you look at the system map, you can see ways around such situations for most landowners, but not all, especially those at the farthest northwest corner of the system, way up west of Delta. Okay, we need to talk about water efficiency just a bit. It is such a hot topic today, and with the Colorado River Compact coming up for renegotiation by 2026, a lot of people are thinking about how we can use less water. And look, there's like a PhD thesis waiting to be written about this. Actually, I'm sure probably several have already been written, but it is not a simple topic. My professional background for the last 20 years has been in energy efficiency, and I can comfortably say water efficiency is more complicated and much less understood, especially by the public. First, some fundamentals. And I'm pulling these from David Owen's great book on the Colorado River called Where the Water Goes. According to Brad Udall, Senior Water and Climate Research Scientist at Colorado State University, there are broadly 2 categories of water use: consumptive and non-consumptive. When a Grand Valley farmer flood irrigates a vineyard with Colorado River water, some of the water goes into the grapevines. That water, along with any water that evaporates from the field, can't be used again. It's in the atmosphere or in the grapes. It's essentially gone. For that reason, it's referred to as consumed. But not all of the farmer's irrigation water goes into the grapes or evaporates. Some of it runs off the end of the field and is channeled back to the ditch system, from which it can be diverted again. Indeed, we do this 7 times in the Uncompahgre Valley with Gunnison Tunnel water, as you heard Steve say. And that excess is referred to as non-consumed, what Steve Pope calls return flows in our conversation. And ultimately, some of that water ends up back in the river, available for additional downstream uses. Most of the Uncompahgre Valley is flood irrigated, and much of that water soaks into the ground and can also be considered non-consumed because it helps maintain the local water table and replenishes groundwater aquifers that feed local wells and surface streams. Here's where it really starts to bend my mind. Remember when Steve said,
the big issue with this drought or drier climate that we've been in is the soil moisture is not there. So as an example, I believe it was 2019, we had a decent snowpack, but we didn't have any runoff because the previous years have been so dry that
just sucked it up.
It just never made it to the rivers.
Imagine if magically all the farmers in the Uncompahgre Valley were able to switch to drip irrigation and the valley's total water consumption was cut in half. If you live in a lower basin state, you might applaud. But what would happen to the flow of the Uncompahgre River through the winter or in the next spring's runoff? Well, picture all of that dry ground. How much less water would be in the aquifer, flowing eventually back to the river? There would be a lot less groundwater flowing to the bottom of the valley and into the river all year long. And then, when runoff came the next spring, how much less snowmelt would make it out of the valley because the entire place had dramatically lower soil moisture content. By flood irrigating this huge valley, we introduce a kind of a reservoir or a buffer into the Colorado River system that makes our rivers higher in the fall and winter than they would otherwise be. Sure, a lot of water is consumed, but also a lot is non-consumptive and ends up right back in the Uncompahgre River, or Gunnison River for downstream users. If the valley's farmers were suddenly much more efficient, it's possible that the valley's true consumption might not decrease that much. Yeah, there'd be less evaporation, but the non-consumptive return flows, the below-ground aquifer flow, would all be much less. And it's not exactly clear that just letting that non-consumed water flow down the Gunnison River instead of diverting it into the tunnel would be significantly better for downstream users. Look, I am not a hydrologist, and I'm way over my skis here, but my point is, it's complicated. And get this, in general, domestic uses in the house, toilets, sinks, showers, are mostly non-consumptive. Nearly all of that water gets treated at the local sewage treatment plant and put back in the river, or flows from your septic system into the water table and eventually back to the river. But watering your lawn in Colorado, that's almost 100% consumptive. Almost all of that water goes to growing the grass or evaporation. But that's all for users in the upper basin places where we're sending water downstream. We're exporting water. Efficiency is a different story at the end of the system where there's no one to send your non-consumed water to. Say you live in LA. Yeah, you have the same complications around irrigation efficiency and groundwater or water table recharging. Gosh, just Google California groundwater recharge programs if you ever get interested. They are getting much more sophisticated about using their aquifers as reservoirs to store water on a multi-year basis between wet years and dry years. But when your sewage is treated and flows into the ocean as treated domestic water, as many in California do, 100% of your sinks, showers, and toilets cannot be reused. That's all consumptive use. And the less you use, the more is available for other people in the system. Look, this should really just be a whole nother podcast where I get actual experts to speak to this instead of me. Let me know if you'd like to hear that. But suffice to say, the benefits of, quote, saved water depends entirely on where it is saved, and the benefits to the entire system is complicated. And certainly, a toilet flush saved in Colorado does not equal a toilet flush available in Los Angeles. This ambiguity, this complication, makes policymaking difficult, makes public education difficult. It's going to take the West's brightest minds to maximize the human benefit to the 50 million inhabitants of the Colorado River Basin, as the water we all depend on becomes less reliable. Now you have the fundamentals of how Gunnison Tunnel water is distributed across the Uncompahgre Valley and some of the complications of that distribution. Let's shift to the management of the volume of water the valley needs. Guess what? It turns out that the 1,100 cubic feet per second flowing through the tunnel in the summer is not enough to meet the needs of the valley. And the Uncompahgre Valley's water supply is connected to a larger system with multiple, often competing interests. Let's dive in. Engineers suspected that even with the tunnel in place, there may still be seasonal shortages, especially in the late summer, when flows through the tunnel may not be enough. And ideas for a reservoir were considered as early as 1903, well before the tunnel's completion. And after water shortages in 1931 and 1934, the Water Users Association asked the federal government to build Taylor Reservoir. The Reclamation Service looked at reservoir sites all over western Colorado to store water to benefit the Uncompahgre Valley. They performed detailed surveys to calculate the volume of water able to be stored for at least 8 sites in the upper Gunnison watershed. Bids were awarded for the construction of Taylor Park Reservoir Dam in February of 1935, and the dam was completed by 1937 for a total cost of less than $1 million. The reservoir's capacity is 106,230 acre-feet at an elevation of 9,330 feet above sea level and is located at the Taylor River, 20 miles upstream from the head of the Gunnison River. Water from the reservoir flows approximately 100 miles down the Taylor and Gunnison rivers to the Gunnison Tunnel. That water flows through 3 reservoirs and 3 dams before reaching the east portal of the Gunnison Tunnel. Those dams are The Blue Mesa Dam, which holds back Colorado's largest reservoir, Blue Mesa, that has 2 turbines with a total of 86 megawatts of electrical generation capacity. Morrow Point Dam is next, just above where the Cimarron River joins the Gunnison. That has 2 turbines with a total capacity of 165 megawatts. And then Crystal Dam is just upstream of the tunnel's east portal, and that has 1 turbine with a total capacity of 32 megawatts. These 3 reservoirs and dams are collectively known as the Aspinall Unit and were built between 1962 and 1976, with Blue Mesa and Morrow Point dams built pretty much in parallel in the early 60s and Crystal Point Dam built in the 70s. My dad actually set concrete forms on the Crystal Dam just before my sister and I were born. Wayne Aspinall was a Democratic U.S. House Representative for Colorado from Palisade. He was in the House of Representatives for 24 years and had a major focus on Western water issues. Taylor Reservoir functions as a bit of a backup for Steve and the farmers of the valley, a reserve, if you will. When late season flows in the Gunnison and Uncompahgre are insufficient, Steve and the water users can elect to release water from Taylor Park Reservoir for the Uncompahgre Valley. This came up in conversation with Steve when I asked how they decided when to open and close the tunnel each season.
We meet with the Bureau of Reclamation, or we meet with our water users, first of all, and then kind of get an idea of, how many of them, as they change crop types, onions need water really early. Mm. And the more people that put onions in, the greater demand we have down valley. And, it takes a while to just charge these canals up to get water in them.
I'll bet, like days or weeks?
Well, to get everything burned and clean and charged up, I would say weeks to get our whole system up and running. But okay, we do it, as that demand comes in. So we'll usually start burning and cleaning, in February. They're dependent upon the board, and they pool, they're out there in the community talking to all the other big producers, and we're talking to the big producers and seeing what the demand would be. But generally we start the tunnel up that first part, mid of March to get things going, and then, by 1st of April they want some water.
Yeah. Okay.
Typically we run on a water year, which is, it'd be April. Generally speaking, it's about mid-April, because they don't all turn on at the same time, but we need to have that system charged up. And then by the time that everybody gets fully, planted, meaning they'll put the onions in first, and then they go into the sweet corn and corn. By mid-May, latter part of May, pretty much everything's in the ground. We're irrigating, and then they'll start pulling sweet corn out, and then onions, and later field corn and other things. So we run mid-April through the end of October. This year,
this interview was at the end of 2023.
My guys took a kind of a beating on the sweet corn with the bugs that they'd had, and so a lot of them asked to put some winter wheat in and things like that. We wanted to stretch it a little bit, and unfortunately, Blue Mesa has to operate, they operate the reservoir, but then they have icing issues. So they have a target level that they need to be at by December.
They need to be below a certain level?
Yeah, so they have an elevation, a target elevation. So we were talking with the Bureau. They said that we're going to run water in December to get down to our target elevation. And so I met with the Division of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation, and we agreed that, hey, can we release a little bit of that water early?
And keep your guys going with their winter wheat.
Which allowed us to get about 2 more weeks of irrigation. Otherwise, it would have come out of our Taylor Park pool. So we also control the Taylor Park Reservoir. So we have 106,000 acre feet. And the way that works is if our diversions out of the tunnel exceed the inflows into Aspinall, then I have to make a release out of Taylor Park. And we have a fixed pool there, which we don't want to use in November. We need it in the early part of the spring. So by them making that release earlier, then we were allowed to use that, and it didn't impact any of our Taylor Park water. And it gave our farmers the opportunity to put winter wheat in, and put quite a bit of it in this year, and give them a head start for getting things wet.
Cool.
So we coordinate with Division of Water Resources. we work very closly with Tri-County on the Ridgeway operations.
Sure.
And the Bureau. It's we have weekly, bi-weekly calls.
So if the tunnel is taking more water out of the Gunnison River than is flowing into the river upstream, then Steve has to make it up with water out of Taylor Park. And really, Steve wants to have that water available in the spring for early season irrigation so farmers can get crops started when the valleys are warming up, but before spring runoff has started in earnest, or in the fall when waters through the Uncompahgre are drying up and he wants that water available. See how a reservoir can extend the growing season, allowing for earlier start and, if required, a later harvest? It's actually pretty awesome. Remember when Steve said,
we work very closely with Tri-County on the Ridgeway operations.
Sure.
And the Bureau. It's we have weekly, bi-weekly calls.
He's referring to Ridgeway Reservoir, the other major reservoir connected to the Uncompahgre Valley. The Ridgeway Reservoir was built in 1987 and has 2 turbines with a maximum of 8 megawatts of electrical capacity. The reservoir is critical to the operations of the Uncompahgre Valley Water Users Association, but also to other water users throughout the valley, including folks upstream of the reservoir. You might think, wait, how can a water user upstream benefit from a reservoir? Get a load of this and listen closely.
It's funny, if you think about just the sheer numbers, if we were to operate the tunnel alone, not relying on the Uncompahgre, we could only satisfy about 50% of our shareholders. The Uncompahgre doesn't participate a great deal. We have a senior water rights on the Uncompahgre River, so we have the ability to call out at the M&D. That is our calling point.
That's the Montrose and Delta Canal.
And what happened is as these projects bought into the Gunnison Tunnel project, in the early 1900s, they transferred their water rights to the water users, and they all made them alternate pointed at the M&D canal. So we can conceivably legally place a call if we're short of water. And if we were to place the call at the M&D, we would call out 80% of Ouray County. What has happened
Sorry, just so I understand.
Sure.
So those water rights are older than the tunnel, and that's from people who put that water to work before the tunnel.
Before the tunnel. They're all 1890s.
Okay.
1897. So we have a portfolio of water rights that we could place a call at the M&D, which would basically tell 80% of Ouray County to stop what you're doing and send us all your water. What has happened in 2021, we entered into an agreement with Ouray County. They had hired an engineering firm, and they calculated what their yield was and what their consumption was, and we entered into what is called a no-call agreement. So they have acquired some water in Ridgeway Reservoir. They contracted with the Bureau of Reclamation. There's a case, and I don't know if it's in the paper occasionally, it's called Ramshorn Reservoir.
Oh.
So up outside of Ouray, there's a reservoir called Ramshorn, or proposed reservoir.
Okay.
It's been decreed, I think, quite a long time ago, maybe in the 60s.
Wow.
It's never been built. But they were trying to get a change and to get some a water right to construct it. It's run into some opposition. One of the components of that was they were going to put a diversion out of Cow Creek, which runs into the Uncompahgre River just below Ridgeway Reservoir, and they were going to divert some of that water into Ridgeway Reservoir. And then if they would make it available to us to basically allow uses above Ridgeway to continue when we were short. And so they haven't quite figured out the Cow Creek pipeline yet, but Ouray County went to the Bureau of Reclamation, who has a portion of pool of water in that reservoir, and they leased it.
Oh.
And they leased 3,000 acre feet.
From the Bureau?
Yes, from the Bureau. And so we entered into this agreement that basically states, if you give us 3,000 acre feet of water, then we won't have the need to place a call.
We won't have to call.
And so they purchased it, and it's in our account. So
okay, this gets a little complicated, but stick with me, because the concept at play here is a beautiful example of how water law, which can often have a brutal reality, can be made to flex for society's needs. Ouray and Ridgway, both in Ouray County, are upstream of Ridgway Reservoir and far upstream from where Gunnison Tunnel water enters the Uncompahgre River. But because farmers down valley near Montrose put water from the Uncompahgre River to use before most folks in Ouray, those rights that call at the Montrose and Delta Canal, the M&D, are senior. And that means that if farmers in Montrose, Olathe, and Delta aren't getting 100% of their allotted water from the Uncompahgre River, Steve can, quote, call out, as he says, the junior upstream users in Ouray County. This includes many farmers and at least Ridgway's water treatment plant. Now, imagine you're a new dad, say, mom's at work, and you go to mix up some formula for your infant daughter. And when you turn the tap on to fill the bottle, instead of a stream of clean water like you're used to, your tap just gurgles and sucks air. Then you find out that the reason that you don't have water and you can't feed your baby is not a pipe break or something like that. No, it turns out that the Ridgway water treatment plant had to shut down because sweet corn and onion farmers down valley were not receiving the water they are legally entitled to. You'd be pissed, right? I mean, how could someone be prioritizing corn and onion crops over your daughter's baby formula? Well, that's just the way water rights work. The law of prior appropriation says that whoever put water to use first is entitled to that portion of water, and those that came after have to turn off first when there's not enough water. Water rights are established first with a shovel and then with a pen, at least back in the day. Again, this is a whole nother episode of the podcast, but this is the way it works, and the Uncompahgre Valley water users have some of the most senior water rights on the Uncompahgre River and the Gunnison River. So, Ouray County took the proactive step to act on behalf of all water users in their county and is exploring all kinds of ways to secure water in Ridgway Reservoir so they won't get called out by senior downstream users. Overall, it's called augmentation. Okay, so Ouray County puts 3,000 acre-feet into Ridgway Reservoir. Right now, they just lease it from the Bureau of Reclamation, but in the future, they hope to build a reservoir high in the San Juans and put it into Ridgway Reservoir via a pipeline. Steve Pope and the Uncompahgre Valley water users are uninjured. They get all the water they're entitled to, and the Ouray County water users get to keep putting their local water to work. But what happens when it's really dry and folks in Ouray County can't even come up with anywhere close to 3,000 acre-feet to deliver to Ridgway Reservoir? What then? Well, this no-call agreement covers that situation by saying, if forecasts show that Ouray County won't be able to deliver at least 1,000 acre-feet of water that year, well then, Steve can call him out and say,
Stop what you're doing and send us all your water.
But hey, that doesn't make Steve and the Uncompahgre Valley water users the bad guys in this story. To the contrary, I think this agreement is an excellent example of how different competing interests can reach resolution to get everyone's needs met. Efforts by Ouray County and other interested parties continue to further bolster water security for Ouray County, just as counties and municipalities across the West are doing every day. Remember when Steve said,
We work very closely with Tri-County on the Ridgway operations.
Sure.
And the Bureau. It's weekly, bi-weekly calls.
And we covered the Ridgway Reservoir part of that, but who's Tri-County and how are they a part of this story? Well, Tri-County operates Ridgway Dam and is the biggest water utility in the valley. But interestingly, they have no way to get water out of Ridgway Reservoir and into their treatment facility east of Montrose. No kidding. The treatment plant that actually serves a group of 7 water utilities, collectively called Project 7, has a small reservoir called Fairview, just above the plant east of Montrose. They use that reservoir to store raw water to be treated, and the only way to fill that reservoir is with water from the Cimarron Ditch when it's running in the summer, or the Gunnison Tunnel. So in the winter, the tunnel is the only possible source of raw water for the valley's treatment plant. And Steve and his team open up the tunnel every 2 weeks or so throughout the winter to fill Fairview Reservoir so all 50,000 residents of the valley can have potable water. Tri-County is a water conservation district that supplies treated domestic water to thousands of people throughout the Uncompahgre Valley. But they didn't actually start as a water utility. They actually formed in very much the same way as the Uncompahgre Valley water users. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation was looking to construct the Dallas Creek Project, what we call Ridgway Reservoir today. And just like the Reclamation Service back in 1904, the Bureau required that the local parties organize under a single organization to interface with the Bureau of Rec. So just as the Uncompahgre Valley water users operates the Gunnison Tunnel, a federally owned project, Tri-County Water operates the Ridgway Reservoir, also a federally owned project. So Tri-County emerges as an organization to interface with the feds, and also in those early days, there was an intent to create a valley-wide domestic water distribution system. So they partnered with the city of Montrose, who had a treatment plant on Cedar Creek just downstream from the west portal of the tunnel, and became the largest water distribution utility in the valley. By now you're probably thinking, I don't know, Brody, you lost me here. I thought this was a podcast about the Gunnison Tunnel. So what does this all have to do with the tunnel, you ask? And why is Tri-County operating a dam and reservoir that has no physical connection to their treatment plant? Well, wait till you hear this. So, Tri-County and 6 other water utilities in the valley organized under a common group called Project 7 to pool their resources and consolidate all of their treatment plants into one. They, too, applied for a federal grant and loan program to improve the water treatment plant east of Montrose. That's right, there's only one treatment plant for all of them. Yes, this is the treatment plant that has water rights in the Cimarron Ditch, but guess what? That's not enough water, and collectively they rely on water rights that Tri-County has in Ridgway Reservoir. So how does it work then that Steve turns on the tunnel every 2 weeks or so in the winter to deliver water to Fairview Reservoir for the Project 7 water treatment facility?
So the way this system works is as we divert water in the summer and the winter months into Fairview Reservoir, for every gallon we deliver into the reservoir, they give us a corresponding amount in Ridgway Reservoir. So Project 7, Tri-County and the different municipal entities, they hold water in Ridgway. But they don't have, if they were just to release it, they don't have a way to get it into the treatment facility.
Fairview.
So we put it into the treatment facility and they exchange that amount of water for us. So now we have up to 9,000 acre feet of water that we can exchange up to Ridgway Reservoir for the water that we would deliver to Fairview Reservoir. And then we've purchased some additional water as a company, and then we have this pool of water for the no-call agreement. So we're operating, we control about 23,000 acre feet of water in Ridgway Reservoir that we can release at our discretion.
Pretty cool, eh? Paper pipe. And of course, Project 7 sees the obvious resiliency risk here in having only a single raw water supply be a 115-year-old tunnel. And so, look, they're building a new treatment plant just downstream of Ridgway Reservoir that will be able to use raw water from that reservoir and supply water to the whole Project 7 distribution system. Once that's built, Steve and his guys won't have to open the tunnel every couple of weeks in the wintertime. Okay, there's one more pretty cool aspect of the system I want to cover here. I got a copy of this interesting book from Sally Johnson at the Montrose History Museum. It was published in 1905 and is called The Uncompahgre Valley and the Gunnison Tunnel. And from what I can tell, this book was written to entice people to come settle in the valley. It's full of beautiful old pictures of the valley and bountiful crops being grown, and it really makes you think, gosh, how could I not come settle there? This sounds like heaven. Well, it is pretty nice here, but I'll say the book is full of kind of hyperbole and exaggeration. Well, one of the things that the book says is that the South Canal, with its numerous drops, is, quote, estimated that it will produce power to the amount of 6,000 horses. That's about 4.5 megawatts. You see other references to hydropower, quote, lighting the entire valley in other early writings. People were talking about using the falling water in the project, especially on the South Canal, to make hydropower or electricity. Well, it took them about 100 years or so, but we did eventually get there. And now there are several low-head hydroelectric facilities generating electricity when the canal runs. Here's Steve.
These projects started probably in 2011-ish. They started the first few. So there are 4 power plants that are on the South Canal, and then we have one out in the Chavano Valley.
Oh.
Right below what's called Chavano Falls.
Okay.
And the top two are drops 1 and 3, and we are partnered with DMEA on those, the Delta Montrose Electric Association. And so they operate them, but we're 50-50 owners in them. The next drop down, the next two power plants, or the next power plant down, we're partnered with a company that built them all called Sorensen Engineering and Mountain States Construction. And they own the lion's share. We're a partner in that plant. The drop 5, we own 100%, and we lease it back to Sorensen. And then we own a percentage of the one in Chavano as well.
Okay.
So they're power plants. They only run during when the canal's on. It's not
Obviously.
We do have a power right, but there's limitations on when we can call for that. And then additionally, we're building right now a power plant at Taylor Park Reservoir. We're partnered with Gunnison County Electric, and it's a smaller plant, but it's going to run year round. It's a 500 kW plant, but there is the potential once they get some better infrastructure up there. That dam, the potential energy on that dam, I believe, was like 5.5 megawatt.
Yeah.
So we'll hopefully pump that up as the demand. The limiting factor there is their contract with Tri-State Energy only allows them to produce a certain percentage of their power in-house.
Oh.
And so we'll see where, even with this one, it was only like 2%, but we'll see if it ever comes up to where they can utilize that to generate a little more power.
Pretty cool, eh? That's clean, zero-carbon electricity being generated right on the Uncompahgre project for local communities. I haven't really gone deep on the financial side of the canals or the operations today, but you get the picture. It's a huge, complicated system and takes a big team of very skilled people to operate and maintain. Also lawyers, lots of water law experts keeping things straight. But this section of my conversation with Steve kind of blew my mind.
In 2015, the water users, I believe it was 15, sometime right around there, the water users received a grant from the River District, and we had a company, or Cal Poly came out, and it's called an ITRC report, and it's basically a system analysis of efficiency, risk assessment, on aging infrastructure, and it's just this huge study they did on our system to say, hey, these are some of the things that you're going to have to work on maintaining, aging infrastructure. These are ways that you could be more efficient in your water movement management. The challenge we really run up against is the cost. So we are a nonprofit. So being a nonprofit, 85% of our revenues have to come from shareholder assessments. So theoretically, we charge our shareholders so much per share, and that's what it costs to operate our system. When we get into maintaining it, okay, there's the maintenance, there's the cleaning of the canals. That's one thing. But these larger infrastructure improvements.
Yeah, you want to replace a siphon on the West Canal.
And the costs to those are just staggering right now. So we have to secure grants. We grants don't really impact our percentage if it's a grant funding.
Wait, so when all the water users pay, like bills just went out for the year for next year. And mine's $300. my 1 acre.
Yeah.
You're saying that the majority of that goes into just day-to-day operation. You don't carve out a bunch that builds up in a large capital fund?
No. We have a very small emergency rainy day reserve account, but
if you want to make big, if you wanted to, look, we need to replace a siphon once a year for the next 10 years, that's not coming from water user fees.
No.
So where's money for that kind of stuff come from?
We put in grant applications.
To who?
For federal government bureau. The Bureau of Reclamation has these water smart grants, the Inflation Reduction Act and this $8.3 billion that they've carved out for water infrastructure improvements, and we really have to look at solely grants. The problem with some grants is they'd require a matching component. One of the benefits, and we've been heavily involved in this for probably the last 20 plus years is the salt and selenium reduction.
Quick background here. If you drive anywhere on the east side of the Uncompahgre Valley, you'll see areas where the adobe mud is coated with a fine white powder. That's salt. And the Colorado River Basin as a whole has a big problem of there being too much salt in the system.
And so we've piped a fair portion of our east side of our system to reduce the amount of salt and selenium that's introduced into the river. Those grants, we've been very successful for two reasons. Number one, we had really poor soil. So when they ran the calculations on how much we could save, they loved us because we can really reduce a lot of salt. Right now, I believe it's close to 60,000 tons a year that we're keeping out of the river.
Cool. Because you've piped or lined.
Because we piped and lined, primarily piped laterals.
Okay.
And the benefit that we run into is we can do the piping work, the labor. We install that. So that meets our cost, instead of saying that we do in-kind labor instead of coming out with a financial outlay. And so that helps us. But as an example, we've got a project out on the M&D Canal where it was sloughing off, and we received a grant from the Fish and Wildlife Service, the NRCS actually, it's called a PL 566 grant. And originally we were trying to get 100% grant funded for the project in engineering based on public safety, but it really didn't qualify for that. So we got the grant that covers the design of it, the design and engineering. And this is lining a section of the M&D Canal, which is about a little over a mile. The engineers laid out the design. They came back with 3 proposals. You could put it all in a concrete box culvert. You could concrete line it, or you could line it with a PVC liner. The concrete box culvert was $24 million for the mile. So that money would have to come from our shareholders. That's not practical. So again, we got to find grants and things that we can, buckets of money that we can come in and help offset that. Wow. And that's the biggest challenge. I go back to that ITRC report, and everybody says, well, there's this tremendous amount of money out there.
Yeah, that's
billions of dollars.
Yeah, I think of the IRA. The IRA is the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in August of 2022.
Right. Number one is getting the money from wherever it is to our project is just almost an insurmountable challenge. We have to have the engineering in order to just apply for the grant. We have to, it would probably take a couple $1 million in engineering just to say, hey, this is the project.
This is how much money we need, and this is the project we're proposing.
And that money would have to come from
users.
Well, or another grant, because you can't combine 2 federal grants. So we get grants from the state, the CWCB, to maybe design the project, and then we go to the federals to help us pay for the project.
Well, there you go. Call me naive, but I had no idea going into this interview with Steve that so much goes into keeping this system functional. And I suspect, unless you're a real water geek, that you didn't either. Now look, this is the biggest, most complicated irrigation project in the state of Colorado, but much of what you've been hearing about here, learning about, can be extrapolated to water issues around the West. Thanks so much for spending your time listening to me in this whole series on the Gunnison Tunnel. I hope you're leaving with a deeper appreciation for what it took 115 years ago and what it still takes today to keep the fields green and the taps flowing. The West is full of stories like this, but I hope now when you drive by an irrigation canal or see a diversion dam on a river, you'll remember just how much goes into those water uses and how important it is that we all have some fundamental understanding of what's happening with the water around us. If you enjoyed this, let me know, and I hope you'll tune in again for my next series that will focus on small hydroelectric plants in the mountains of southwest Colorado and the fascinating history about those. Special thanks in this episode goes, of course, to Steve Pope, General Manager for the Uncompahgre Valley Water Users Association. Steve, you are so generous with your time, and your expertise is inspiring. Thanks so much for the work you do. Keep it up.